Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historic events, issues, and people. The person we're analyzing today is Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States, the first Secretary of State, one of the Founding Fathers, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. He has a monument in Washington, D.C. He's on the nickel. For those of you in other countries, that's what we call a 5-cent coin. Most people don't realize that Jefferson is also on the $2 bill. Of course, few people are aware that $2 bills are still printed. Whenever I go to the bank, I get as many $2 bills as I can because my dad liked them and it reminds me of him. Along with Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Teddy Roosevelt, Jefferson is one of the 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore, the 60-foot granite sculptures carved into a mountain in South Dakota. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson is a big deal in American history. When I was growing up, Jefferson was lionized. All of his incredible accomplishments were featured in textbooks, but they skipped over the flaws in his character and some of the darker aspects of his life. That's the problem with monuments in the nation's capital or having your likeness carved on Mount Rushmore. People see a larger-than-life figure instead of a real person. I greatly admire some of Jefferson's accomplishments, but I abhor some of his deeds, especially regarding slavery. A lot of these people from history who have achieved great things also did some terrible things. It's the nature of being human. In this episode, we're going to look at the good and the bad of Thomas Jefferson. Let's start with a very short biography. Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, on a plantation in the British colony of Virginia. In case you're not familiar with that expression, plantation, that was a term mostly used in the American South for a large farm, usually operated with slave labor. He grew up in a wealthy family. He stated that his first memory was being carried on a pillow by an enslaved woman. He attended the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Later, he studied law and practiced as an attorney for several years. On January 1, 1772, Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton. She was his third cousin. Martha was only 23 years old, but was already a widow. They had 6 children, but only 2 lived to adulthood. They were both daughters, Patsy and Polly. They lived on a plantation which Jefferson named Monticello. That's Italian for Little Mountain. If you want to see what his house looks like, look at the back of a nickel. He already owned many slaves, but when his father-in-law died in 1773, Jefferson inherited 135 more enslaved people. Martha died on September 6, 1782. She was only 33 years old. Jefferson never remarried, but he did have a long-term relationship, which I'll examine later on. Jefferson loved politics. He served in the House of Burgesses, which was a legislative assembly in Virginia during colonial times. He was a delegate at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. That was the group that proclaimed independence from Britain on July 4, 1776. Jefferson served as governor of Virginia for part of the Revolutionary War. After the war, he went to Paris to negotiate treaties in 1784. The following year, he became minister to France for the newly independent United States and held that position until 1789. While he was in Paris, a new constitution was written in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. Pursuant to that constitution, George Washington became the first president of the United States. Washington appointed Jefferson as the first Secretary of State. After serving 2 terms as president, Washington retired. In 1796, John Adams was elected president and Jefferson was elected vice president. Thomas Jefferson served as America's third president from 1801 to 1809. After serving 2 terms as president, Jefferson retired to Monticello. In one of the most amazing coincidences in American history, Jefferson died at age 83 on July 4, 1826. That was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In another coincidence, Jefferson's friend John Adams died on the same exact day at his home in Massachusetts. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Adams was unaware that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier that day. It seems that both Jefferson and Adams were willing themselves to stay alive until that 50th anniversary. On the evening of July 3rd, and then again after midnight, Jefferson asked, "Is it the 4th?" And I might as well throw in a couple of other odd facts about presidents and the 4th of July. Exactly 5 years after Jefferson and Adams died, our 5th president, James Monroe, died on July 4, 1831. What are the odds of this? One president was born on Independence Day. That was Calvin Coolidge, who was born on July 4, 1872. Now that I've given you a general outline of Thomas Jefferson's life, let's get into some of his specific achievements and failings. Let's start with the Declaration of Independence. I think that most people, including Jefferson himself, believe that this was his greatest accomplishment. It is the founding document of the United States. The Revolutionary War started in April 1775. A little over a year later, people were still debating whether the 13 colonies were seeking a reconciliation with King George III of Britain or outright independence. The Second Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. That was a meeting of delegates from the 13 colonies. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in Congress to declare independence. On June 11, 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a statement that the 13 American colonies were no longer part of the British Empire. The committee consisted of 5 people: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson. The committee realized that somebody would have to prepare a first draft, which then could be edited by the other members. They agreed that Jefferson should write the original draft. From all accounts, Jefferson was a poor public speaker, but people were already aware that he was a tremendous writer. Jefferson prepared his initial draft of the Declaration supposedly in only 17 days. Some people diminish his accomplishment by saying that he was influenced by the writings of some of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. That is nonsense. Of course, anybody, when they are drafting a political document, is going to use the ideas that they have read from others. But Jefferson deserves the credit for writing a masterpiece. Members of the committee and other members of Congress made changes to his original draft, but most of the eloquence of this incredible document comes from Jefferson. I'm not going to read the entire Declaration of Independence, but I do have to read the opening paragraphs. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. Jefferson then listed the various grievances against the British monarchy. I'm not going to go into them here because they're not important to this episode. But I've always loved the ending of the Declaration of Independence. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That is just incredible writing. I wish I could write like that. Amazingly, he was only 33 years old when he wrote the Declaration. To be fair, Benjamin Franklin made a slight edit to probably the most famous line in the Declaration. Originally, Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." It was Franklin that changed sacred and undeniable to self-evident. And that's how we get the founding principle of American democracy. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Jefferson's words inspired people around the globe. Here's one that you wouldn't expect. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared an independent Vietnam in a square in Hanoi. Of course, it would take another 30 years of warfare to achieve that autonomy. I am not a fan of Ho Chi Minh, but I find it amazing that when he declared independence for Vietnam, he quoted, in Vietnamese, Thomas Jefferson's immortal lines that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's switch to somebody that I do admire. Abraham Lincoln considered that part of the Declaration of Independence as the fundamental basis of the United States. He said as much on November 19, 1863, when he delivered a few words to dedicate a cemetery for those who died in the greatest battle ever fought in North America. Of course, that oration is known as the Gettysburg Address and is considered one of the greatest speeches in American history. Lincoln began that very short address like this: 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That is the goal that the United States was and is trying to achieve. As a country, we don't always live up to that ideal. Just ask the Native Americans, blacks, and just about all minorities. But it is our objective. Even though as a country or as individuals we often fall short, we still strive towards that goal of proving that all people are created equal. In prior times, they would say men or man as a shortcut for mankind, but they meant all people. And as much as I appreciate the brilliance of his writing, which has inspired Americans for 250 years and countless others around the globe, we have to ask this pertinent question. Although Jefferson expressed this idea, in such a powerful way, did he, in his personal life, aspire to the proposition that all people are created equal? Unfortunately, the answer is a resounding no. Jefferson held people in slavery his entire life. It is estimated that throughout his life, he owned approximately 600 people. He had the most slaves of any of our presidents. Some people try to excuse this aspect of Jefferson's life by saying that he was a person of his time. There is certainly some validity to that. We do have to consider cultural norms of the society and time in which a person lived. 200 years from now, people might look back at the way we live as barbaric or cruel. Who knows? But even considering the times and place in which he lived, Jefferson still fails on this issue for several reasons. Reason number one, he knew better. I know some of you might be thinking, of course, all of these slaveholders knew better. No matter what they said, it's difficult to believe that anybody did not know deep down that this was an indefensible system. But Jefferson was worse because he thought a lot about this issue. He's the one who wrote, "All men are created equal." But when he wrote that, he owned approximately 175 human beings. In 1774, Jefferson wrote a pamphlet titled "A Summary View of the Rights of British America." In that booklet, he wrote, "The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state." He admitted that slavery was an abomination and should be eliminated. When he was an attorney in the 1770s, Jefferson represented people challenging aspects of Virginia's slavery laws. Representing a mixed-race man in the case of Howell versus Netherland, Jefferson argued, "Under the law of nature, all men are born free. Everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person, which includes the liberty of moving and using it at his own will. This is what is called personal liberty and is given him by the author of nature because necessary for his own sustenance." In his lifetime, Jefferson only wrote and published one book. That was in 1785, titled "Notes on the State of Virginia." When discussing slavery in that book, he stated, "I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just." There is no doubt that Jefferson understood that slavery was inhumane and unjustifiable. To his credit, while he was president, he promoted and then signed the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves of 1807. That did not end slavery within the United States. It only stopped more people from Africa being imported to the U.S. to become enslaved starting January 1, 1808. However, that law did not stop the slave trade within the United States. Human beings could still be sold as pieces of property inside the U.S. Throughout his life, Jefferson bought and sold people. And Jefferson did not take any steps to eliminate slavery within the U.S. According to the New York Times, he did the opposite. When he was serving as a state legislator, he blocked consideration of a law that might have eventually ended slavery in Virginia. Defenders of Jefferson say that he wanted to end slavery in Virginia and throughout the United States, but he was afraid of what would happen. In a letter in 1820, Jefferson wrote about slavery as follows, "But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation in the other." Jefferson admitted that he understood the barbarity of slavery, but he was afraid to end slavery for fear of reprisals by the newly freed people who had suffered all their lives. Reason number 2 Jefferson fails on this issue of slavery: he did not free his slaves as many of his contemporaries did during and after the Revolution. Out of the 600 people that Jefferson owned throughout his life, he freed only 2 of them while he was alive. George Washington freed many of his slaves in his will. Without going into details, for some legal reasons, he was unable to free all of them in his will. Don't get me wrong, I do not applaud slaveholders who freed people in their will. Of course, it's much better than never freeing them at all, but to me, it seems that you kept these people enslaved when it mattered to you, and you finally set them free after you were dead and it didn't cause you any inconvenience. The reason I bring this up is because Jefferson didn't even do that. He did free 5, yes, only 5, of his approximately 130 to 200 enslaved people at the time he died. I've read different figures. The rest of those poor people remained as human chattel. From at least one source I have read, many of the slaves at Monticello were sent to the auction block after Jefferson died. Reason number 3 Jefferson fails on this issue of slavery: he was not a particularly kind master. Don't get me wrong. I hate when people talk about a kind slave owner. That is a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing. By definition, being a slave owner is a horrible thing. But it's true that some masters were worse than others. Jefferson sometimes punished his enslaved people by selling them to other plantations. One of the few things that could make being a slave even worse was being sold off away from any family that these poor people might have had. Besides selling off people as punishment, Jefferson sometimes did it because he needed the money. That is truly looking at people as capital. And that's the way he viewed his enslaved people. In 1820, Jefferson wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." Although there is no evidence that Jefferson ever beat any of the enslaved people at Monticello, he did have overseers who did it. In case you're not familiar with that term, an overseer was usually a white man on a plantation who kept all of the slaves in line. How did they do that? Strict discipline, including severe physical violence, the threat of death, the threat of mutilation, such as cutting off body parts, and of course, being sold to another plantation. Reason number 4 Jefferson fails on this issue of slavery: he had alternatives to running a plantation. Some people tried to defend Jefferson by claiming that slavery was necessary to run a profitable plantation. I'm sure it probably was more profitable to have people work for absolutely no pay. But that's not the point. Jefferson did not have to operate a plantation to earn a living. He was an attorney from 1767 to 1774. He could have practiced law to earn a living. That's what I did for 31 years. Instead of working as a lawyer, he chose to live the life of a plantation owner, with countless people to wait on him and do everything he commanded. Which brings us to reason number 5 why Jefferson fails on this issue of slavery: Sally Hemings. She was one of Jefferson's enslaved women. Sally was born in 1773. Jefferson was in Paris as the American minister to France with his oldest daughter, Patsy, when he sent for his younger daughter, Polly. She arrived in Paris in 1787, accompanied by Sally Hemings, who was only 14 years old at that time. This was before the days of photographs, and there are no paintings or drawings of Sally from when she was alive, so we don't know exactly what she looked like, but contemporary accounts described her as very pretty. Historians believe that the relationship between Jefferson and Sally began around 1787. By the way, I really hate using that term relationship, but I don't know what other word to use. It wasn't a true relationship because it was non-consensual for two reasons. Number one, she was literally his property and she could not say no. Number two, she was only 14, or as some claim, she was 15 years old when Jefferson started having sex with her. What difference does it make if she was 14 or 15? She was still an underage minor who could not really give consent. And he was either 44 or 45 years old at the time. Some people try to claim that Jefferson loved Sally and that she even cared for him. We'll never know, but it doesn't matter. She had no alternative when it came to having sex with this man. As far as the law was concerned, he literally owned her. Certainly, Jefferson was not unique among slaveholders. Being forced to have sex with the master of the plantation was one of the many horrors enslaved women had to suffer. In addition to being sex without proper consent, there was an additional creepy factor of this situation between Jefferson and Sally. That's because Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife. Yeah, you heard that correctly. Earlier I told you about Jefferson's only wife, Martha, who died on September 6, 1782 at the age of 33. Martha Jefferson and Sally Hemings had the same father. Martha's father was John Wales. He had sex with at least one of his slaves named Betty Hemings. John Wales had 6 children with Betty Hemings, one of whom was Sally Hemings. When Martha's father died, she inherited his slaves. That's how Sally became the property of Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. If we know this today, Jefferson certainly knew who Sally's father was. He was having non-consensual sex with the half-sister of his dead wife. Although Jefferson promised to free the children he had with Sally, he did not prepare them to function in free society. He did not teach them to read or write. By the time Sally Hemings lived in France, slavery had already been abolished within France, but not in the French colonies. So why didn't Sally just stay in Paris as a free woman? Why did she return with Jefferson to Virginia in slavery? Some apologists claim that Sally must have really loved Jefferson. As I outlined earlier, it didn't matter whether she cared for him or not. The power dynamic of a man who was 30 years older than her and who had literally owned her for her entire life prevented any true romantic relationship. And in reality, she could not stay in Paris. We don't know if she spoke any French, but if she did, it was very rudimentary. And where would she live? How would she make a living? She was a 16-year-old mixed-race girl from Virginia. Would you feel safe living in a foreign country in such a situation? And add to that the chaos that was going on in France. Jefferson returned to America in 1789. That was the year of the storming of the Bastille and the start of the French Revolution. Throughout most of the 20th century, people would argue that there was no proof that Jefferson was the father of those 6 children with Sally Hemings. That's nonsense. For a couple of centuries, there had been rumors that Thomas Jefferson had fathered several children with Sally Hemings. Even while Jefferson was president, people talked about it. During Jefferson's second year in the White House, on September 1, 1802, an article in the Recorder, a newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, referenced this scandal. A political opponent named James Thomas Callender said in that newspaper account that Jefferson had a long-time relationship and had fathered many children with a slave named Sally. We now have proof of this forcible relationship. DNA tests in 1998 showed that Thomas Jefferson's DNA is shared by male descendants of Sally Hemings. Some Thomas Jefferson apologists have suggested that the father of Sally's children was Thomas's brother, Randolph Jefferson. These people argue that the DNA testing just showed that it was a male in the Jefferson family. That is technically possible, but it is highly unlikely. Randolph Jefferson did not live at Monticello. He lived in another county. This is a situation where Occam's razor applies. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Are we to believe that a relative who lived in another county came over and impregnated Sally 6 or 7 times over the span of many years? Or is it more likely that it was Thomas Jefferson himself? Also, Sally became pregnant in Paris, although that child did not survive. Randolph Jefferson was never in Paris. A 2010 scholarly review of the DNA testing concluded that Thomas Jefferson is most likely the father of at least 6 children born to Sally Hemings. Regarding this issue, even the website Monticello.org states that the Thomas Jefferson Foundation holds the view that the issue is a settled historical matter, that Thomas Jefferson is the father of Sally's children. On to another subject. One of the best things that Thomas Jefferson did was his advancement of the separation of church and state. And, as far as I can tell, there were no contradictions in his positions or actions when it came to freedom of religion. In 1779, Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It was finally passed by the Virginia General Assembly on January 16, 1786. That was while Jefferson was serving as the American minister to France. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was passed mostly through the efforts of Jefferson's close friend, James Madison. Of course, Madison had many of his own accomplishments, including being the 4th President of the United States, and is almost universally recognized as the father of the U.S. Constitution. And speaking of accomplishments, Jefferson had so many, but he chose only 3 to be listed on his tombstone. Here is how the engraving at his gravesite at Monticello reads. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. He did not list serving as President of the United States, Governor of Virginia, U.S. Minister to France, or any of the other amazing things he accomplished. The 3 items he listed on his tombstone show what he considered were his most important achievements. Here is the critical section of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess, and by argument to maintain, their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. You may have noticed that I said burthened instead of burdened. That is the way Jefferson wrote it. That was an archaic use of the word burden from those days. It's significant to note that the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom became law before the Constitution was written, which means it was before the Bill of Rights. The original Constitution, written at the Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, did not contain a list of fundamental rights and civil liberties. From his ministerial post in Paris, Jefferson wrote to his friend James Madison to add a Bill of Rights specifically listing such freedoms and protections. In a letter from Jefferson to James Madison dated December 20, 1787, Jefferson told Madison that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights providing clearly and without the aid of sophisms for freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protection against standing armies, restriction against monopolies, the eternal and unremitting force of the habeas corpus laws, and trials by jury in all matters of fact triable by the laws of the land. Madison did not think it was necessary, but relented and prepared the Bill of Rights, which became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Partially as a result of Jefferson's urging, the First Amendment reads in pertinent part, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Years later, it was Jefferson who expanded on this concept expressed in the First Amendment. He was the one who coined the expression, a wall of separation between church and state. That term has become commonplace in American doctrines. Where did that phrase come from? It arose from a dispute in Connecticut. Although I've lived most of my life here in California, I was born and raised in Connecticut. Fun fact, the town where I was born, Greenwich, Connecticut, was founded in 1640. That was only 20 years after the Mayflower landed in Massachusetts. I know that people in Europe laugh at the idea that 1640 is considered ancient, but by American standards, it is. Here's a second fun fact relating to Connecticut. The official nickname, which is on the license plates, calls Connecticut the Constitution State. As explained on the official Connecticut State website, they chose that name because, on January 14, 1639, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were adopted, and it has long been claimed that this was the first written constitution in history. Other historians dispute whether the first written constitution was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Ever since I was a little kid, I've heard of the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, but I've never read that document until now. I just read it. It's not very long, and you can find just about anything online. It was pretty wild that in 1639, people got together to prepare a written constitution for their own government. Even though the people of Connecticut had adopted their own constitution with the Fundamental Orders, the government in London had not sanctioned that colony. This was remedied in 1662 when King Charles II granted an official charter. Getting back to today's topic, according to ConnecticutHistory.org, Congregationalism remained the established state religion until 1818. Even non-Christians could be taxed to support the established Congregational church. This is where Jefferson comes in. Some Baptists from Connecticut wrote to Jefferson because they felt like they were being persecuted since they were not part of the official state religion of Connecticut. On January 1, 1802, President Jefferson wrote to the Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut. Here is the pertinent part of that letter. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson and most of the founding fathers were committed to a secular state. Throughout European history, there had been wars between countries, and sometimes civil wars, and persecutions based upon religion. The idea was that the United States would allow everybody to follow any religion they pleased or follow no religion at all. Atheists, as well as all denominations, are welcome in this country. That was the purpose behind the First Amendment stating, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Many of the civil liberties protecting American citizens are set forth in the Bill of Rights and other parts of the Constitution, but those freedoms are stated as broad principles. Courts often need to determine the meaning, application, and extent of those stated rights. With regard to the separation of church and state based upon the First Amendment, the U.S. Supreme Court relied on Thomas Jefferson's writings. In the 1879 case of Reynolds versus United States, the Supreme Court referenced Jefferson's Virginia statute for religious freedom as a basis for religious freedom. And the Supreme Court also quoted that paragraph I just read to you from Jefferson's letter to the Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut. Jefferson's phrase regarding a wall became a foundation of American constitutional law. In the 1947 case of Jefferson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court stated, "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable." 1 year later, in 1948, the Supreme Court stated in McCollum versus Board of Education, "Neither a state nor the federal government can, openly or secretly, participate in the affairs of any religious organizations or groups, and vice versa." In the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. The Declaration of Independence and his promotion of religious freedom are Jefferson's two greatest legacies. To be a country of true religious freedom for Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, any religion, as well as agnostics and atheists, is one of the great ideals of the United States. We may not always live up to that goal, but it is the national ideal. Now let's talk about Jefferson and the military. He had a lot of contradictions in his views and actions regarding the armed forces. When John Adams was president, the Army and Navy were expanded. This seemed prudent as the very young United States seemed to be at the mercy of the two superpowers at the time, Britain and France. Adams expanded the Army from a ridiculous number of approximately 800 men to around 5,400 soldiers. Adams also expanded the Navy to 13 active frigates and ordered construction of 6 ships of the line. If you're not familiar with that term, a ship of the line was the premier naval warship during the Age of Sail, meaning wooden ships. They were essentially the battleships of their day. In addition to the new naval ships, Adams oversaw construction of coastal defenses. And on July 11, 1798, President John Adams signed an act for establishing and organizing a Marine Corps. This military expansion greatly helped in the quasi-war against France during Adams' presidency. When Jefferson became president, he greatly downsized the military to approximately 3,300 soldiers, and up to 1/3 of the officer corps was removed. He wanted to rely more on state militia, which were not very reliable. Jefferson reduced the Navy to only 7 frigates and halted construction of the ships of the line, which had already been approved by Congress. This was very short-sighted and proved disastrous in the War of 1812, even though that war occurred after Jefferson left office. There were multiple reasons for that war between the U.S. and Britain, including the British supplying arms to the Native Americans on the U.S. frontier. But probably the number one reason was the Royal Navy stopping American merchant ships and the impressment of sailors. That was a nice way of saying that they were kidnapping sailors off of American commercial ships and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. It is estimated that approximately 10,000 Americans were impressed into service in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. Jefferson left office in 1809, but his close friend James Madison followed him in the White House. He essentially continued most of the policies of his political hero Jefferson. It's called the War of 1812, but it dragged on for 2.5 years. It began when the United States declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. The peace treaty ending the war was signed on December 24, 1814, in Ghent, in what is now Belgium. But because news took many weeks to cross the Atlantic, a major conflict was fought after the peace treaty was signed. The Battle of New Orleans occurred on January 8, 1815. It is considered the biggest victory for the U.S. in that war, even though it was after the peace treaty was signed. Andrew Jackson was the American commanding general at the Battle of New Orleans and became a national hero. This eventually led to him being president from 1829 to 1837. Getting back to Jefferson, his military cuts greatly hampered the American war effort against the strongest nation in the world at that time. Although the war is always listed as a draw because the U.S. did not give up any land or other concessions to Britain, the War of 1812 was not good for the United States. There were a lot of humiliating defeats. Of course, the worst was when the British Army burned down the White House and the U.S. Capitol building on August 24, 1814. I side with the many historians that blame both Jefferson and Madison. You can't take on the most powerful country in the world without a sufficient military. If you don't want to get pushed around by Britain and France, you need to build up the Army and Navy. To his credit, in his State of the Union address on November 5, 1811, Madison did generally ask Congress for military preparedness in case of a war with Britain, but very little was actually done before war broke out 7 months later, and the U.S. was woefully unprepared. In a weird incongruity with his overall military stance, it was Thomas Jefferson who started the U.S. Military Academy, commonly called West Point. It was officially created on March 16, 1802, when President Jefferson signed the Military Peace Establishment Act. I commend Jefferson for doing so. Now let's talk about Jefferson's greatest achievement while president, the Louisiana Purchase. I did an episode fully examining the reasons for and the ramifications of the Louisiana Purchase. So if you want details, listen to that episode. But here's a very quick summary which relates to today's topic. When Jefferson became president, the borders of the United States were from the Atlantic Ocean to the east, the Mississippi River to the west, what is now Canada to the north, and Florida to the south. In those days, when they talked about Florida, that meant all of the present state of Florida, as well as the Gulf Coast all the way to the Mississippi River. Jefferson had his emissaries in Paris offer to buy New Orleans from France, which was ruled at that time by Napoleon Bonaparte. The Americans were surprised when the French offered to sell all of the Louisiana Territory, not just New Orleans. The Louisiana Territory was enormous. It was essentially all of the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, from Canada down to around Texas, and including what is now the state of Louisiana. Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory and essentially doubled the size of the United States. This is one of the greatest achievements by any president ever. I believe just about all Americans, are very happy that Jefferson bought Louisiana. Of course, I'm not counting the Native Americans who lost all their land when the United States and the European powers were dividing up the Americas. Although the Louisiana Purchase is heralded as a great triumph of his presidency by just about everybody, including me, Jefferson was acting in a very hypocritical manner when it came to the powers of the federal government. Did Jefferson have the legal authority to buy Louisiana? I certainly think so, and most historians agree. But Jefferson didn't really think he had the power to buy Louisiana. During the administrations of George Washington and John Adams, Jefferson was always arguing for strict construction of the Constitution. The basis of his party, the Democratic Republicans, was in opposition to too much federal authority. The opposing party during Jefferson's time was the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton. When Washington was president, Jefferson and Hamilton served in his cabinet at the same time as Secretaries of State and Treasury, respectively. During the Washington administration, Jefferson opposed practically everything that Hamilton wanted the federal government to do. Jefferson argued that the federal government was limited to the express powers specifically listed in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lists the powers of Congress. The last paragraph of that section is referred to as the Necessary and Proper Clause. It says that Congress has the authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Hamilton argued that a national government must possess energetic powers corresponding to the vast and often unpredictable obligations it faces. He argued that the Necessary and Proper Clause expanded the specifically enumerated powers. Hamilton contended that if the Constitution granted a specific power to Congress, then the Constitution also granted the authority to employ the means to execute that power. If the Constitution granted the federal government the authority to do something, such authority would be meaningless without the power to use the necessary tools to accomplish those goals. Hamilton argued that such implied powers were not new, but were merely incidental jurisdiction to achieve the functions of Congress that were specifically enumerated in the Constitution. Getting back to the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson himself really doubted that he had the authority to buy Louisiana from France because such power is not specifically listed in the U.S. Constitution. In a letter to John Dickinson, dated August 9, 1803, regarding the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson said, "But there is a difficulty in this acquisition which presents a handle to the malcontents among us, though they have not yet discovered it. Our confederation is certainly confined to the limits established by the Revolution. The general government has no powers but such as the Constitution has given it, and it has not given it a power of holding foreign territory, and still less of incorporating it into the Union. An amendment of the Constitution seems necessary for this." Jefferson realized that a constitutional amendment would take way too much time, and Napoleon might change his mind, and this incredible deal might slip away. In a 180-degree political turn, he decided to act like his nemesis, Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson was not going to follow a strict construction of the Constitution. There is no specific provision in the Constitution that allows the federal government to buy land from a foreign country. But he really wanted to buy Louisiana and decided to argue the way Hamilton would. Now it was Jefferson who was arguing that this power to buy land was implied under the authority to make treaties with other countries found in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, which gives the president the power to make treaties provided such treaties are ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. On October 20, 1803, the U.S. Senate ratified the Louisiana Purchase by a vote of 24-7. I am with the vast majority of Americans and historians that think Jefferson did the right thing by contradicting his strict construction stance and simply buying Louisiana. One of the areas where Jefferson clashed with Hamilton was with regard to the economic system of the United States. When they both served in Washington's cabinet, Hamilton developed a plan whereby the federal government would assume all of the debts from the individual states resulting from the American Revolution. Hamilton believed that the consolidation of the national debt along with the debts of the individual states would establish a stable public credit. This would put the national currency on a sound financial footing. Jefferson and his close friend James Madison opposed this plan. Jefferson and Madison were both from Virginia, and their state had paid off most of its debts from the Revolutionary War. Jefferson's legal basis against Hamilton's plan was again strict construction of the Constitution. The Constitution did not authorize the federal government to assume debts owed by the states. But this was another situation where Jefferson was willing to act inconsistently regarding his political stances, provided he could get what he wanted. At a dinner held at Jefferson's home, located at 57 Maiden Lane in Lower Manhattan, the three men worked out what has been called the Compromise of 1790. At the time, New York City was the capital of the United States. Jefferson and Madison would agree to Hamilton's financial plan if the nation's capital was moved down to their beloved Virginia. To get the powerful congressional leaders from Pennsylvania to agree to this plan, the capital was moved to Philadelphia for 10 years, while a brand new city was created with land carved out between Virginia and Maryland on the Potomac River. This is how we got Washington, D.C. as our nation's capital. I've always thought that this bargain to move the capital reflected poorly on Jefferson and Madison, but made Hamilton look really good. Hamilton was trying to do something for the good of the entire country. And by the way, Hamilton lived most of his life in New York City, so he was giving up something personal to him. Jefferson and Madison only went along with a plan they opposed so they could selfishly get the nation's capital next to their home state. Jefferson had a vision of the United States as an agrarian society. He wanted America to be a land of small farmers. Most Americans should be on their own farms and self-sufficient. Jefferson was fairly consistent with regard to this long-term goal for the country, but his actions and policies sometimes undermined this dream of an agricultural utopia. There were a lot of problems with this view. Number one, it was odd that a man who lived on an enormous plantation with hundreds of enslaved people should state that the goal of the country should be individual farms operated by the common man. Number two, Jefferson wanted the United States to be self-sufficient and not rely on Europe. But if he really wanted to avoid the entanglements of Europe, then America would need its own industry. Farmers can be fairly self-sufficient, but they do need products that are manufactured. Before the Revolution, there was extremely little industry in the 13 colonies. The Americans supplied raw materials for Britain's manufacturing industries, and the Americans relied heavily on imported manufactured goods from Britain. Well, if you don't want to be dependent upon the British or the rest of Europe, then have your own homegrown manufacturers. One of the necessary items for that would be a national banking system. In December 1790, Hamilton submitted to Congress his proposal for a national bank. Of course, Jefferson opposed Hamilton's plan. Jefferson thought that a national bank would assist the merchants and other business interests who tended to be creditors. Most family farmers and even plantation owners, including Jefferson himself, tended to be debtors. But this was a ridiculous argument because they were debtors anyway. Why was it better to be debtors to local state banks or international banks in London than banks in New York or Philadelphia? Congress sided with Hamilton, and President Washington signed the bill into law on February 25, 1791, creating the National Bank. One other point about the Jefferson versus Hamilton feud. Jefferson always portrayed himself as the representative of the common people. It's true that he espoused a lot of programs for what we would now call the working class. But it is hilarious when he would claim that his rival, Alexander Hamilton, was elitist, but Jefferson himself was not. Hamilton grew up as an orphan in the Caribbean. By the time he was 13 years old, his father had abandoned the family and his mother died of yellow fever. But Hamilton was brilliant and eventually started working as a clerk for local businessmen. When he was older, some local benefactors sent him to the American colonies to get an education. He was a self-made man. Of course, all so-called self-made people have received help along the way. But mostly, Hamilton rose through his brilliance and hard work. Jefferson was born wealthy. When he was 21 years old, he inherited 5,000 acres of land as well as livestock and probably the most valuable asset in those days, around 50 human beings. Throughout his life, he owned approximately 600 people. When he wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he owned 175 black men, women, and children. At his peak in 1822, he owned 267 human beings. I cannot think of anything more elitist than owning other people to serve your every whim. And on a related note, people refer to Jefferson as this brilliant thinker. During his retirement years, he was often referred to as the Sage of Monticello. I was unable to find who started calling him that. That moniker became commonplace when historian Dumas Malone titled a volume of his biography, Jefferson and His Time, the Sage of Monticello. And it's true that Jefferson was a great political theorist, philosopher, scientist, inventor, and architect. He was brilliant, but it really helps somebody's ability to think about things when, at any given time, they literally own 100 or so human beings to take care of every want or need. When you don't have to do anything for yourself, you have a lot more time to sit around and think things through. Thomas Jefferson generates a lot of mixed feelings and opinions among Americans and people around the world. I greatly admire his drafting of the Declaration of Independence, along with the aim that America is to be a country where all people are created equal. We do not always achieve that goal, but at least it's our stated national ambition. I'm thankful that he purchased the Louisiana Territory, which set the expansion of the United States, eventually from the Atlantic, to the Pacific where I live. As Americans, we're not always proud of how our country expanded, but we are pleased that it did. I very much appreciate Jefferson's role in the religious freedoms where people can choose their own religion or choose no religion at all. Separation of church and state is vital to a free society. I disagree with some of his political stances, such as the strict construction of the Constitution. And I think that Jefferson often was not very practical. I think he was simply a dreamer with his view of an agrarian paradise where everybody could own their own land and be self-sufficient. Well, all white people, he meant. That was never realistic without having a manufacturing sector and a military to protect the country. But these are minor disagreements. My primary dispute with Thomas Jefferson is regarding his reprehensible actions regarding slavery. I think I outlined those dreadful behaviors in detail throughout this episode. This is why any society needs to look at their founding members or national heroes as human beings. They are not made of marble or granite. They are not deities. They were people just like us and must be examined with their strengths and their failings. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. If you are listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. Spotify allows comments and reviews of a particular episode. On Apple Podcasts, simply scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all the history geeks out there. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.